Hey, everybody, it's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Great to have you with me today. Happy birthday to me. I'm traveling all over the world and it is my birthday. So I thought, what could be better on my birthday than finally getting the interview that I've been wanting since late December 2021 when Dave Friedberg, yes, one of the besties on the All In podcast and also the CEO of the production board, when he mentioned animal agriculture, how detrimental it is to the earth, how detrimental it is to human health, how detrimental it is, obviously, for animals, and even national security. We'll get into all of that when I finally get my birthday wish, the interview that I've been wanting for a long time. I want to bring on my guest today. Let's get right into it. Dave Friedberg. Dave, thanks for being with me.
Happy birthday. I didn't know it was your birthday.
Yeah, I know. You said you were available, and I was like, you know what? I am too. Happy birthday to me. So
Awesome.
I'm super happy to have you with me. Of course, I listen to the All In podcast like everybody else, but I also follow everything that you do with the production board where you invest in life sciences, agriculture, alternative proteins, energy, to basically formulate, if that's the right word, a better planet by being smart with our science and using life sciences to create a better world for all of us. So that all tends to hover around alternative proteins and plant-based innovation. So let's dive right into why you're doing what you're doing and how much help the sector needs. Before we do that, let's give everybody a little bit of a foundation. So you've been a longtime vegetarian, I believe, and also an environmentalist. So how do those two things reconcile in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised a vegetarian and had kind of, I guess, eco-conscious conditioning my whole life. So certainly I think that there's a tie-in between how we make things on Earth and the, kind of irreparability of those actions. And animal agriculture is a really good example. It's pretty intensive in terms of resource utilization and doesn't need to be. So, as I kind of think about how do we, give humans more, right? I think a big part of how we should orient ourselves in terms of the ultimate quest for humanity should be around abundance. How do humans get more? Because that's how we're programmed, is to always look for more. But how do we do that in a way that actually uses less? And animal agriculture is a linearly scaling system that, as you demand more, which is what happens as people have more GDP per capita, they consume more protein per capita, and we end up, using more resources in a non-renewable way and in a kind of degrading way. And so there's, like with all other human technologies, there's points of leverage that I think we need to explore that allow us to be more productive with our limited resources. And in doing so, I think, we retain a lot of the planet Earth in its, kind of persistent state without degrading it. And you don't need to use animals to give people the exact same thing that they're looking for over time. So I think that should be the long-term arc of the objectives with these, call it alt meat industries.
Mm-hmm. I would say that using animals is actually wildly inefficient, and you do yourself an enormous disservice by using animals. So if you wanted a smart business equation, you wouldn't spend 25 to 35 calories of crops to get 1 calorie of cow. You wouldn't spend 15 to 16 calories of crops to get 1 calorie of pig. You wouldn't spend 9 to get 1 calorie of chicken. That's a bad equation. No one invests like that. So to be ultimately, as you say, we are tasked with feeding more people more nutritiously in a shorter amount of time, using fewer resources, creating less damage. That's what we have to do.
I think a lot of people orient, and everyone in the food and agriculture industry says we have to feed more people. But at the end of the day, people buy what they want to eat. Okay. And the more people have to spend, the more of a certain class of foods they spend money on. And there's a natural market force that arises with, a 10 billion person population. That's not just about calories. We could produce calories by, turning sunlight into sugar and giving everyone sugar all day. It's about what do people want to consume. And once they have sufficient capital to consume protein once a week and then once a day and then 3 times a day, that's, a very proven kind of part of social evolution and economic evolution of a particular segment of the market. So that's the real kind of calculus that causes the problem. It's not just about, hey, if I were to land on Mars, what's the most efficient way to make calories and protein? We would solve that problem not by bringing wheat and cows to Mars, right? There would be other systems that we would likely use that are kind of cutting edge technology. But we've kind of evolved this system on Earth where we took crops and grew animals, and then we industrialized it to make those particular products that people wanted more affordable. And that created more access, and consumerism drove demand, and that demand drove more industrialization, and so on. And so a lot of people that raise their hand and say, hey, regenerative agriculture for growing animal protein is a perfect cycle and it's sustainable and so on. The challenge is the cost is higher and it doesn't scale. The way that this demand for protein arises is because we've been able to industrialize the production of beef down to $3 a kilogram, or $3 a pound, or whatever the metric is. And at that price point, tons of people want it, and the market finds its kind of maximal equilibrium, and that's the way the market's evolved. And so that's the real thing that we really have to tackle as we think about evolving markets that are both kind of better for the planet, meaning we're wasting less energy, we're using less resources, we're doing it in a sustainable way, but also meeting the market demand. And those are the two things that are, very difficult to get right. That technology is necessary to solve that lever point.
Sure, I would argue that you can't do it without technology, actually, as we go from 8 billion people on the planet to 10 billion people. But, you're not getting more land and you're not getting more water. And both land and water are used extensively in animal agriculture. But you bring up this great point that, emerging markets, India, China, they're getting wealthier, Africa too, coming down the line of developing middle class. And so they're wanting more meat. And so how do we scale to meet that demand? And at a price point where people can get it, because the fastest way to switch over a consumer is to make something that they can afford. And then it becomes less of a culture war. Should I, shouldn't I? But my grandmother, she made this or she made that. Should I or shouldn't I? And then that quickly becomes like, okay, well, it's, 50 cents less. This is what I'm taking home. So is price parity the biggest challenge that the sector faces? And if yes, how do you see the sector accomplishing price parity?
Yeah, I mean, much of what we've talked about in like the food tech kind of universe over the last 10 years, which I think has really been buttressed by the ubiquity of low-cost DNA sequencing and CRISPR tooling, which really blew up the synbio landscape. Suddenly everyone had this idea that I could make this animal protein, or I could engineer this cell to be like beef or chicken or fish or what have you. And it really kind of, gave all of these folks who had, tremendous kind of moral instincts and, certainly thought that there was a commercial application now to go after it. So the tooling suddenly exploded. But ultimately, if you can't beat the price point of the existing product in the marketplace, or beat parity from a, food taste perspective and nutrition perspective, you're not going to win the mass of the market. You're going to address 5% of the market. And that's really what so much of food tech, unfortunately, has gotten kind of in this rut on. It's a product that's a premium, and you sell a premium price product to people to feel good. You buy a Louis Vuitton purse and you feel good walking around with your Louis Vuitton purse. You pay $800 or $2,000, whatever the hell people pay for purses, with this crazy purse because it's got a logo on it, and you feel good and you're like, look at me, I got this cool thing. All feel good sales, people buy eco-conscious products and are willing to pay a premium to, feel good about themselves, that they're doing good for the planet. Now, the reality is that the addressable market for that level of product is a real kind of small market. It's about 5% of the world's people that have sufficient excess income to spend on doing good for the planet. Most people in the world, 95% of people, are trying to get by. They're, they can't pay their bills. I mean, in the US, 2/3 of people don't have enough savings to make it through a small financial crisis at home. And so that's the richest country in the world. You go around the world, as anyone would know, there's a great website called Dollar Street. I always tell people to go look at it. I don't know if it's still around. Anyway, let me know. Hans Rosling's son and his wife did the whole site. But it shows you what it's like to live in different parts of the world and what people live on, their income-wise, and how they spend their money and how they brush their teeth and the kind of toilet they have and the kind of cooking that they do and the kind of food that they have. for 95% of the world's people, they are not thinking in this eco-conscious way, that their priority is to take care of their families, their priority is to get their next meal, their priority is to eat something that tastes good, their priority is to have a full belly. Their priority is just to get something good. And they're not thinking in the way that we all have the luxury of our time and our capital to think about, hey, I can buy a Tesla, or hey, I can do good for the planet by buying a friggin' tote bag and not using a plastic bag, and all the things that our extremely wealthy nation has been privileged to spend a lot of time, or a lot of people have been privileged in this nation to spend a lot of time thinking about and doing. So you really have to beat that price point. You have to get to parity, and you have to make meat that's cheaper than meat and taste as good if you're going to have a shot at winning the 95% of the market. Because even if you grab the whole 5% of the market, you can make a good business. But you don't change the real equation on how we're using resources, what's the damage to the environment, what's the sustainability effect, all the things that we kind of harp on about when we go through these metrics on 30-to-1 energy ratios, 10-to-1 energy ratios on making animal proteins and so on. You don't move the needle on those inefficiencies and the damage caused by those inefficiencies unless you can really address the mass market, which doesn't just mean the US mass market, it means the global mass market. And so we have to get costs down on everything. Yeah. And we have to make these unit economics work.
So I would agree with you 100%. And I would think that most entrepreneurs are also going for that large meat market, that $1.4 trillion global meat market. And they're not going for the elite 5%. They're going for the mass. But a couple of things, in my opinion, have to take place here. And I'd love for you to chime in on this as well. I always say we should work with industry. We need their distribution channels and we need their advertising dollars. So as much as I love the small entrepreneur, and America sort of excels at that small entrepreneur, and I love that we do, I want to see these companies work with even the Nestle's of the world, because I want their distribution channels and I want their advertising dollars. As someone who sold their company to Monsanto, I wondered what your perspective was here. Just a level set for everybody. Your first company, your second company, or maybe it was your first.
The Climate Corporation, yeah.
Yeah, the Climate Corporation that you sold for over $1 billion to Monsanto, which was an app for farmers that was utilized by many farmers and then finally bought up. What do you think about working with meat companies?
In terms of Monsanto? Or
No, so sorry. In terms of working with, let's say, the enemy, if you will, or the industry, meat companies to get their distribution channels, their advertising dollars, bring down costs.
Look, I have sat inside of a lot of what people would call Death Stars. Where people think that there are evil people on the other side controlling machines and of industry that, are purposefully trying to hurt the planet. And, my experience has been that almost all of these places with all of these people, from big companies to governments that I've met and officials and, what the media and people on the outside might cast as being evil people, they're all motivated by the same fundamental principles of taking care of their family, taking care of their country, doing right for the planet. No one wants to destroy the planet. Even at oil companies, they don't want to destroy the planet. They don't want to, hurt their families. They don't want their grandkids to be worse off than they are. And there is a rationalization that's gone on, which is all about giving people what they want. And market forces are very powerful. That on the buy side, when consumers show up at 10 billion, kind of buying power and say, hey, I want to buy stuff, someone has to feed them, someone has to give them what they want. And there's some rationalization that goes on, well, let's do that in a good way. Let's do it in a better way. Let's try and improve it. And the people that are there are trying to figure out ways to improve how that is done. And that is what they're trying to do. And then from the outside, it's like, oh, well, they're the evil. They're the bad guys. The truth is they all want to take things to a good place. So much like we've seen with a lot of energy companies making investments in clean tech technologies and trying to evolve their businesses away from, carbon-based systems to new renewable-based systems and investing in the bleeding edge of the next gen of systems, we have seen, and I think we do see and should expect to see, that the smart people that are running Cargill and Tyson and these companies that I think are just fundamentally doing awful things, right? Because I don't believe in killing animals. So ethically, I think that it's awful. But I think that if there is a path to success, the scale that they have, the scale at which they operate, the resources that they have, the access that they have to feedstock, to sugar, to glucose, to corn processing, which provides feedstock to artificial or synthetic meat production, et cetera, they're hugely advantaged. And if we can build the technology and create the marketplace for those systems to actually work at scale, I think they're likely going to end up being the ones making these products. And so we all sit here and kind of cast them all as the Death Star and we want to destroy them. But the reality is that many of them are making investments in alt-meat companies. Many of them internally want to see these products succeed. Many of them expect that the market will evolve. They know the technology, they understand the science, and they see that it's going to happen. And they want to make sure that they're there to participate. And fundamentally, I think they can actually help accelerate and help the market win. That doesn't excuse the death of all these animals every day from an ethical point of view, which is something I care deeply about. But from a business and environmental point of view, the faster we can see this transition happen, the better. And I think we'd rather say, let's figure out ways to get them aligned and to get them to actually start to build giant systems that make sin meat and, over time reduce their dependence on feedlots and, grazing and slaughterhouses and the other ways that they generate, the system that they use to generate protein today. And let's show them that, hey, you could just take corn, put it in a giant machine, and out the other end of the machine comes the exact same product. And it's at lower COGS, it's cheaper to you, you can make more money, and they see it. So, I think they're waiting for the economics to make sense. And they're actually a very good canary in the coal mine, a very good, kind of beacon on how we are doing as a technology industry trying to develop these technologies. Because the quicker that they adopt, the more that they invest, the more they're leaning in, the more we're actually getting to the point of economic reality that they're saying, now's the time, let's go. Meanwhile, all the startups are like, let's go compete against them. And they're trying to raise $200 million. And then it turns out 200 is not enough, or they raise 50 million. It turns out you need 200. And every startup is struggling to get manufacturing going and get to scale. And, meanwhile, I think if the technologies can be built, you'll ultimately see the big players with the distribution and the large scale and the capital and the balance sheet be the big participants here.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I would say that you have three main things happening at the same time. And because these three are working in tandem, that's why you're going to have sort of S-curve adoption. So you have the consumer, millennials and Gen Z, that are highly focused on the environment. They're very interested in blockchain and transparency up and down the supply chain. They want to know how things are made, what it's doing to their planet. So they're very active. You have industry, as you just said, that is looking for a better bottom line. We talked about it's incredibly wasteful. 25 to 35 calories to get 1 calorie back. Who makes that investment? It's incredibly wasteful. And it's wasteful and bad business at a point when you have subsidies and you're not forced to externalize, to factor in your costs that you externalize, like dumping into rivers and emissions. And as soon as the SEC, if they go ahead and force scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions for companies, you're going to have to start factoring in the costs of, I'm going to have to repair that water. I'm going to have to curb my emissions. So that might make their prices higher. We talk about bringing alternative proteins down, but I think the real cost of meat is a lot more than it's currently offered at the grocery store. So it's two things in play. The risk that you have that industry is going to be held more accountable for how it does its business, and that's going to be more expensive. And then that third factor is government. We saw during COVID and also with the Ukraine war that our supply chains are fragile, and national security is going to start enveloping itself around alternative proteins because food security is going to be an issue. So I think in sort of like stroke of luck, if you will, you've got all key three stakeholders want the same thing at the same time, albeit for different reasons. But I think that's going to bring about this. Let me bring up a chart that I think you might like. You've maybe seen this chart. It's done by Synthesis Capital based on some of the research from Rethink X, but it talks about the potential S-curve adoption of alternative proteins. Sorry, this is so small, everybody, but you kind of see around my cursor here, looking at ramping up. A lot of money to be made in this stage, by the way. It looks small here on the chart, but this is an interesting stage for investors. But around 2025, 2026, getting into price parity of production, according to the author of the study whom I've interviewed, around 2027. Then you see tipping point coming at around 2032, and it goes from there. So I would agree with you. We need industry.
I think one of the things that you see in any new technology market, and this is a way to kind of think about how the market evolves and predicting those points of inflection. And it may be nearer, maybe later, maybe a decade later, 2 decades later.
Of course.
But general orientation on new technology, and this is a new technology, it's about, engineering biology to make stuff for us in a way that we've never had the tooling to do. prior to low-cost DNA sequencing and precision gene editing. But at the start of a new technology market, the first wave is usually vertically integrated companies, meaning they try and do everything. And we've kind of seen this in the synbio alt meat world, where they do both strain engineering or cell engineering, where they're changing the genome, doing the edits, trying to evolve the cell or evolve the microbe that they're using to make stuff, on their own. Then they do process engineering. Then they do scale-up manufacturing. Then they do at-scale manufacturing. Then they're also trying to do distribution. They're also trying to productize. They're also trying to create a brand. Yeah. So trying to do all of this stuff, you're usually going to be not good at one or typically several of those things. The real question is, what's your core advantage, right? What are you uniquely good at? Because trying to do everything from strain engineering all the way through to scale manufacturing and brand and CPG and distribution, usually one company is going to be at best really good at one thing. And so then what happens as a technology market evolves? So those companies usually get outcompeted by some set of horizontal platform players that emerge that are the best strain engineering company, or the best process engineering partner, or the best at-scale manufacturing with the lowest COGS on scale manufacturing, because they built an entirely new model for doing scale manufacturing with automation, machine vision, plastic tubing instead of stainless steel, or the best CPG company, or the folks that already have distribution, i.e. Cargill and Tyson, right? And so I think if you think about like a Cargill and a Tyson, they're not trying to be the best strain engineering company in the world right now, right? They know what they have. They know what they're uniquely good at: scale manufacturing, distribution. So eventually the best strains, the best process, right, the best manufacturing process will all kind of find its way into their systems, or someone will build a better system than them and use plastic, and that's where the commodity advantages will arise from. And ultimately, I think that the market evolves to not just one or two kind of vertically integrated mass players, but you probably see a couple of these horizontal folks. Like, think about computing, right? We have network switch companies. We have companies that specialize in making just GPUs, like NVIDIA. And then we have other companies that specialize just in making CPUs, and other companies that make RAM, and other companies that just do software, other companies that just do the app layer on the internet. So there's all these kind of horizontal or platform specialists that are so uniquely good and advantage at the one thing that they do, then they service the whole industry and an ecosystem evolves. And I think we're at the beginning stages of seeing synbio, call it whatever you want to call it, 1.0, 2.0, whatever the current wave is, evolve into this next wave, which I think is much more about horizontal specialization and folks that are really good at one thing. And the sum of all those really good things is what gets the unit economics to where it needs to be, instead of one company winning and getting there and starting with the Tesla Roadster and eventually getting to the Model 3. I don't think that's a reality in this space. I think we're finding folks that have unique technologies that they're applying to doing strain engineering, unique technologies to process engineering, unique technologies to making new kinds of continuous flow, precision fermentation tanks at scale. I mean, there's just so many technologies that are being developed right now, or new kinds of recombinant feedstock for growing cultured cellular meat. So I think that there's a whole set of these sort of interesting new startups that are emerging that are likely going to be in aggregate the great unlock on the commodity price point that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At my company, VegTech Invest, in the public markets, we focus a lot on this B2B supply chain. I think really that's where the big growth is going to be, because I think the end consumer products are going to be bought up by the Cargills, who, by the way, as you know, have changed their name from a meat company to a protein company, right? They get the vision. I've interviewed them on off the record interviews, and they've said, the food system's going to change. And when it changes, it's going to happen really quickly. And we want to be there. We don't care what we feed people. We're just here to feed people. They just don't think about the ethical part at all. If people are wanting meat, we're just going to give them the meat that the planet can do. And we're going to make money on that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, like, if you look at Givaudan, Givaudan a couple of years ago, they had a big push for plant-based proteins. And, then in their annual report, I forgot which, I think it was 2019 or 2020, they kind of declared how they were wrong. That the demand curve for the plant-based proteins, where they thought the consumer was going to be there, kind of went up and to the right, and then it flatlined and started to kind of come down a bit. And they had this big kind of like realization that maybe the market isn't quite there yet, because it's a premium price point, right? And so a lot of those ended up being a bit challenged in terms of.
But they haven't backed off.
They've invested
quite a bit.
Yeah.
They've invested in a plant-based innovation center in Brazil. They're investing in cultivated meat in Switzerland. They've got a West Coast plant. I speak to them kind of a lot. They're pretty.
So as these guys build out the infrastructure, as all the big guys build out the infrastructure, as the technology enablers create the great unlocks, I think in aggregate we see the market getting there.
So when will that be?
I think that's how you can start to track and get the inflection points. Well, if you ask anyone go to, let's go to Peoria, Illinois, and you're like, per capita, I would guess average income there is 50K or 48K or something. And you're like, hey, what would you spend on a burger? They're not going to give you a price that's higher than a McDonald's burger. They'll try it out once in a while, but they're not going to pay a premium. And that's where we really need to kind of track to that endpoint where you can see that inflection point happening.
I totally agree with you. So I see what we need to do to get there. And I still want an answer to that timeline of when you think the horizontal specialties are going to come to make this inflection point really possible. But so then are we leaning on the industry players? Are we looking at all to government regulation, government policies? I do think we need to bring the price down, but I also think meat needs to go up in price because of its costs that up until now, they've all been externalized and we pay for them as a society. These companies, for the most part, do not. So when are we counting on government as well to get us there? Or are we just looking simply at existing industry or investors?
I guess I would agree in principle to that argument, but the practicality of it and the pushback is typically around, people have talked generally about a carbon tax, and let's say you trace this back to a carbon tax. That the biggest concern around the carbon tax is just fair and reasonable, uniform accounting. How do you know that you're actually accounting for these, the carbon, and you could debate that for decades and not come up with you could have two scientists argue both different numbers completely and have good data to support it. And then if you do end up imposing the carbon tax in a global trade environment, you end up seeing a lot of the production move offshore to markets that aren't taxed. Right. And that actually goes to a place that's even dirtier and less clean than the US, or has worse production practices than the US. And so the pushback would then be, look, if we do this, there's still going to be sourcing that's looking for the lowest price point. And if we enable sourcing from the lowest price point that's offshore, that's actually doing things in a worse way, and we can't control that, then we've really just hurt our companies and we've hurt the US companies where we can regulate. And maybe it's the US plus the EU. And then there's also this fundamental populism thing. I mean, you saw what happened in the Netherlands with the taxation and the impact on the dairy industry that caused massive protests and popular unrest and so on. That if you do actually try and raise these prices, if you do actually try and tax people, you both hurt the industry rises up, and you hurt the people, and the people rise up. So it's a very, 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 very difficult kind of regulatory thing to pull off. There's just so many competing reasons why it's hard. And that's why, frankly, after knowing all this stuff for 20 years, the arithmetic is the arithmetic. I can agree with you in principle, but getting it done is everyone's we've tried. Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately you just need the technology unlock. You just need to make a better mousetrap than using an animal.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And we've talked about some of the inefficiencies of using the animal. Just to kind of go over that a little bit more. It's not just the calorie inefficiency, folks. Just imagine this. We have trees, we cut those down and we grow crops that have protein, crops that have fiber. Are we feeding that food to people? No, we're feeding that food to animals. Those animals need land, water, time, more crop deforestation. Then you're growing more crops, still not feeding that food to people. You're still feeding that food to animals. So extremely inefficient, and one might say inhumane for both animals and people. And we can talk a little bit about that too. A lot of people say, well, why do you care so much about animal welfare? And I always say, well, animal welfare is human welfare. There's a huge influx of antibiotic resistance because the animals are so sick. You have to give them antibiotics, and then we're ingesting too much antibiotics so that when we need them, they actually don't work because we have antibiotic resistance. So to me, it's all linked. You can't really separate the planet and its devastation, animals and their devastation, and what's going on with people on the planet. I diverge a little bit from the economic conversation, but let's get back to it. One of the things you were saying is engineering biology to basically create, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, basically create the food that we need in a more efficient manner. Could you explain, just because I think people hear engineering biology and they get freaked out, GMOs or what have you. So, and GMOs, by the way, folks, I talk about it a lot on this show, could be nefarious. Doesn't have to be, isn't nefarious by definition by any means. In many ways is the future and good for us. So maybe you could help people understand engineering biology and what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, a couple 100,000 years ago, there were these proto-humans wandering around on planet Earth, and they were eating whatever they found lying on the ground. Okay, dead carcasses and berries on the ground and whatever like was left over on the Earth. And that early species of humans or pre-humans were pretty close to extinction, I would imagine, many times over due to starvation. At some point in our history, and folks have debated the age at which this happened, humans realized we could take a seed from a plant and put it in the ground and a new plant would grow. And we effectively realized at that point that we could actually engineer the earth to make our food for us. And that is what agriculture is. A lot of people have the modern day kind of, warm and fuzzy vision of farming is good, it's good for the planet. But if you actually think about, you're taking nature and you're engineering that piece of earth to make things that you want that piece of the earth to make for you. So I would argue agriculture itself is, humankind's first technology. And it's been an evolving technology since the dawn of humanity, where, up until 30 years ago, we knew very little about the genome of the organism, about the DNA that made up that species. We realized that when we took one corn plant and another corn plant and crossed them and we planted all the seeds. We took the bigger corn plant and we replanted that one. That allowed us to do plant breeding and to improve the productivity of that plant species in terms of how it utilizes the earth, in terms of how many calories per square foot it can generate by sucking up the sun and using water and, using nitrogen from the ground and carbon from the atmosphere to make stuff. And so, agriculture is in and of itself an engineered biology that humans have harnessed since the dawn of our species to do things. And over time, we've gained better and better insights into how that works. You've heard of Mendelian genetics, and you can create a little chart and you can figure out what parent line drove what child and what the probability of that happening are. And plant breeding, which really saved humanity in the mid-20th century, Norman Borlaug and the breeding revolution that won him the Nobel Peace Prize, really saved probably 1 billion people from starvation and death in Asia and in Central America and so on. And so it was a very technical breeding exercise that he undertook through this work. And then as you go forward a couple decades after Norman Borlaug, suddenly this technology with DNA sequencing arose where we could actually take that plant and rather than just look at what's called the phenotype or the output of the plant, we could actually look at the genotype, which is the DNA of the plant, and figure out what genes or what DNA was causing what thing to happen in the physical world and causing the plant to be taller or fatter or shorter. And then we realized, hey, we can actually be smarter about breeding. And we can start to breed these plants together and pick the ones that have certain genes. And so that became what's known as molecular breeding, which is just plant breeding, except you're picking things based on the DNA rather than picking things based on how they look. And so you kind of move along that spectrum. And a couple years later, we realized, so, I'll kind of give the Genentech story. Genentech was the first company to produce recombinant drugs, which means they could take the DNA that coded for human insulin, which is a little gene. They put it in E. coli bacteria. They put that E. coli bacteria in a giant tank, and they could get that E. coli bacteria to make copies of itself and make insulin and so on. So they engineered biology rather than doing what we did before, which is that we slaughtered, millions of pigs and got the insulin from their pancreas. We could now actually engineer an E. coli cell to make insulin for us. And that created this great unlock in terms of synthetic biology or more engineered biology, where suddenly we could take the DNA and we could be more specific about the changes we want to make and more specific about what we could do to drive some phenotypic or physical, trait-based outcome in biology. And we're applying that capability. So GMOs, just to give everyone some clarity on this definition, GMO is about taking foreign DNA that's not native to a plant species and sticking that DNA into a plant, and then that plant will start to make that protein. And the reason that they've done this, for example, in the case of corn rootworm GMO trait in corn, is you now get the corn plant to make a protein that was found in nature, and this protein that was found in nature kills corn rootworm, and you put it in the corn plant and it kills corn rootworm. So you can take that protein, you can actually test it on other biology, you can test it on humans, you can see if it's safe, but you're giving the plant the ability to protect itself from corn rootworm. And that was a GMO trait, but it is taking foreign DNA from another organism and sticking it in corn. But much of what's going on in biology today is also just turning certain genes on or off, or adding or taking away specific letters, where we know what that change will do to the organism. We know what it will do to the protein. And we know specifically, not just, hey, let's see what happens, but we can actually be very deterministic about some of the engineering we want to do, because we now have this toolkit to not just read the DNA, but to also write the DNA and take letters out, put letters in, and be very specific. And it sounds like Island of Dr. Moreau, scary, oh my gosh, we don't really know. But if you spend a couple of hours watching YouTube videos or going to lectures or meeting people in the industry, you get scared the first time you hear about some crazy new technology. But as you start to understand it, you start to understand how scientists are thoughtful about the things that they're doing, how we're careful about it, how there is regulatory, 3 regulatory regimes involved with independent scientists reviewing everything, how, there is a good system of understanding what's going on and why, and the testing that goes on. You start to, I think, get a little more comfortable with it. And it's really hard to convey that in 30-second sound bites to someone. And so engineering biology to do better for the planet is the real goal for everyone involved in this work. It's not Island of Dr. Moreau stuff. The challenge is, how do you do it in a way that gets everyone comfortable, where people don't want to spend more than a TikTok video understanding something new. And so this is new stuff, right?
It's super new stuff, and yet it's not. It's just advancing on what we've already been doing, and we've been doing it because it works for us. Business rewards efficiency. That technology, which is more efficient, which brings us more convenience, brings down the price, causes less damage, is that which is adopted. And we've already adopted this for better seeds, for better protection in other areas, for getting humans insulin that isn't impacted by African swine fever, for example, like pigs in China are, and pigs in the US as well, actually. So, you have a more secure supply of insulin for people. Also, that insulin isn't going to be tainted with antibiotics or fecal matter or any of these kinds of things. So you do it because it makes sense. Anyways, just to cliff notes for people. So it's not something that is that new. It's just continuing to advance, and it's in the right hands is something that really is better for society. So let me take that idea of engineering biology and bring it back to economics and maybe even cultural, societal issues. As we open the newspaper every day, or we go on the website every day, and we talk about this debt ceiling and the debt, and what kind of impact do you see alternative proteins, plant-based innovation playing in ramping up the economy? I mean, if we are going to be doing more and more engineering of biology and creating more technology that is mass adopted, like we saw potentially on that S curve, like the iPhone was adopted, or like the computer was adopted after the typewriter, or the car was adopted after the horse. If we see this kind of mass adoption, you're talking about not just Brooklyn and LA that got the memo, but you're talking about Africa, China, India, old, new, young, religious, not religious, every sector of society adopting new technologies and bringing them into their life. That's an enormous amount of money, job, wealth, job creation, et cetera. What do you think about alternative proteins playing a big role in the economic health of the United States, for example?
Well, remember, all economic growth, if it's not inflationary growth driven by money printing, right, it has to come from productivity gains. And, where you can spend $1 and get $1.50, or spend $1 and get $2. If you can spend $1 and get $2, that wins in the market, and you actually see real economic growth, because then the people that make the $2, they'll spend more on other stuff, and then those people will spend more, and that's how the economy grows.
Sure.
And I think ultimately, the real question is, everyone needs to eat protein, right? We need call it 10 to 15% of our calories to come from protein. And, if we can generate that protein, and everyone would prefer animal proteins over, the majority of humans would prefer animal proteins over plant proteins, or greater ratio thereof. So the real kind of productivity driver question is, can you make, proteins at a lower price point per gram or per kilogram? And if you can, and people want it because it tastes the same and looks the same and feels the same and all that stuff, then more people will buy that cheaper product. That market will take off, and the marginal gain you'll get, the excess profits you generate from that new system, will get reinvested and the economy will grow. So just like any other technology market, productivity gains arising from a transition in the food system can be really beneficial. There's also a great land unlock potential here, right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Depending on how you look at the statistics, right? There's call it 10 billion grazed acres on Earth, right? And those 10 to 15 billion, whatever the 10 to 12 billion, whatever the number is, pasture land, ranch land, grazing land. If you had a cheaper way of generating, animal proteins rather than using these systems, and some people would argue there's a regenerative effect associated with that. So maybe you want to keep livestock in those parcels of land, but if you no longer need the intensive production of calories as feedstock for animals or the large amounts of land, then you can rethink what you're using that land and those resources for, and that unlocks new markets and new opportunities.
Starting with sequestering carbon.
You could, yeah. There's a lot of options, right? And I think generally we don't really know. The market decides what they're going to pay for. So, there will be some value that will arise from this stuff. If and as we can take more resources out of the equation. Again, if you think about it as a generally 10 to 30x energy into energy out equation for making animal protein, then if you take that 10x down to 3x, you've got a lot of excess energy, excess land, excess resources available to reinvest elsewhere, to make other stuff that humans might want to use in other interesting ways.
Which is why I think it could jumpstart the economy. And also be, we talked about this a little bit, but from national security perspectives, I think people are going to be very tight with their IP on food technology. And, the U.S. has been okay there, but there are other countries around the world, China, Netherlands, Israel, Singapore, that are advancing as well. And I wouldn't say that we're leading by a great margin. What do you think about? Do you have a hard out? I want to be respectful.
I could go a few more minutes, and then I need to get ready.
Yes, of course. Okay. So we'll get to wrap it up here. But what do you think about national security and owning the IP of food?
Yeah. So as we all know, wealthy, food insecure countries are the first to try and adopt these new technologies. They're all investing ahead of the curve. So you can see this in Gulf states. You can see this in Singapore. You can see this in net importers around the world, right? So food security obviously being paramount to any nation state. And so those that have excess profits or excess capital or budget to invest are seeking these technologies first. And it makes a lot of sense. Look, at the end of the day, protein and fat, carbohydrates and fat are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay. And you can get carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from water in the atmosphere pretty directly. And then proteins, you kind of add in a little nitrogen, a little phosphorus, a little potassium. Just start with that kind of elemental summary of, what makes up the foods that we consume. And if you can basically take the free and abundant, CO2 we have in the atmosphere and ocean water that is generally available to most nation states, and convert that into carbs, fats, and proteins that people want to consume, you've created a great unlock. And if you can do it at a cheaper price than paying others to grow it for you and import it. And so I think that's a real, this century solution. I don't know if it's this decade or next decade or the decade after, but certainly this century solution where we could all have effectively food printers that can make all the food we consume today looking the same as we consume it today, tasting the same as we consume it today, just taking all those biological systems that we rely on multiple steps in the system today to make stuff and putting them all into one integrated, machine that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, takes water, sucks up some nitrogen from the atmosphere, and makes exactly what you want to make, and prints out your food for your people. So, that general dream is a bunch of dreams before that one, a bunch of visions before that one. But those other visions, as they create more food security, and it's a good place to invest. And so we are seeing a lot of these concepts being invested ahead of the curve by these wealthier nation states because they just make a lot of sense.
They just make so much sense. And I always tell people, your burger's not going away. Your meat's not going away. How we make it, that's going to change. But you're going to have all the foods you love right there in your kitchen. A couple quick exit questions because I know you're tight on time. If you can do it, one sentence, how do you think AI is going to change the S-curve adoption of alternative proteins? Basically,
again, like a big chunk, I wouldn't say the whole, but a big chunk of the equation, I'll give you two answers. A big chunk of the equation is changing the genome, changing the DNA of a cell to do the things we want it to do, like replicate, like a muscle tissue cell from a cow, so you can grow beef. Okay, how do you get it to grow faster? How do you get it to grow efficiently? How do you get it to not waste energy? And the genome is just a data set. And so as we combine that data set with the three-dimensional models of what that genome realizes in terms of protein structure, and you combine it with metadata, we can start to be highly predictive. And AI can play that role. Excuse me, I got really bad allergies. The other one is generative design. So we can use AI to actually design industrial systems to make stuff for us using engineering concepts that humans don't come up with. And we're seeing this across the board in industrial engineering today. Pretty powerful. So I think both of those applications of AI can have pretty profound accelerating impacts on these technologies. So think about that specification or specialization I mentioned before, the industrial scale manufacturing, let AI design and generate the materials, the flow, the machine vision system, everything that goes in scale manufacturing. Let AI design, and they'll have a better, smarter system than a human coming up with creative ideas and thinking that they're smart. And then let the AI, let the AI make recommendations to genome edits that can ultimately get the cell to be more effective, more productive, make it cheaper, et cetera.
It's life affirming. Really, it's life affirming. It's so awesome. Exit questions, one sentence, and I'm not kidding now. One sentence. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
I guess the biggest change for me in the I guess AI is probably a big one right now. If we could have seen a little bit ahead of the curve on where AI would be, or had greater confidence on the timing of when these capabilities are hitting, investing ahead of that would have been ideal. Also, the U.S. debt problem is a disaster. So talk about that one another time.
Yes, we will. You're having a bad day. What is a phrase you tell yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
Just zoom out a bit.
Zoom out of
zoom out over time or space or context. So,
oh my God, you're having a busy day. You don't have time for lunch. Last question. What's your go-to snack?
I eat Cliff nut butter bars by Cliff Bars.
Okay, we leave on Cliff nut butter bars. Dave, I want to thank you so much for being with me. What a great birthday present for me. I could talk to you for hours, and we will talk about debt next time if you come back. And I think alternative proteins could have an impact on debt. So very cool. Everybody on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Oh my gosh, what a special Plant-Based Business Hour. I will see you all next time. Dave, stay put just for 2 seconds. Bye, everybody.